Hello and welcome to the Lost Ladies Found YouTube channel. Another talk today about Frances Sheridan, whose play The Dupe we have on the channel from 1764. It's a great comic play and I hope you enjoy it. Just thought that I'd give you some sort of background information on Frances and the play. But before we begin, we're going to talk about her son, Richard Brinsley Sheridan. Now, normally the first thing that people say about Frances Sheridan is that she's the mother of the famous playwright Richard Brinsley Sheridan. In fact, what we should be saying is that Richard Brinsley Sheridan is the son of the famous playwright Frances Sheridan. And there's a reason for that. You notice that our logo has a woman writing and a man peering over the shoulder, trying to copy what she's saying. So that is there, especially for Richard Brinsley Sheridan, because as you probably know, he wrote a very famous play called The Rivals, and in which is one of the greatest comic creations ever, which is Mrs Malaprop, an older lady who mispronounces all her words. The thing is though, Richard did not write Mrs Malaprop. Frances Sheridan, his mother, did. Now, she wrote a character called Mrs Tryfort in her play called A Trip to Bath. It's an unfinished play. You'll notice that The Rivals is set in Bath and that Richard Brinsley also wrote a play called A Trip to Scarborough. Now, Mrs Tryfort, she mispronounces all her words, for example, progeny instead of progedy, and she says contagious countries. They're put into the mouth of Mrs Malaprop by that rogue of a son, Richard. So whenever you think of Mrs Malaprop or you see a poster for The Rivals, what it really should say is by Richard Brinsley Sheridan or by Frances and Richard Brinsley Sheridan, or indeed based on an idea by Frances Sheridan or something like that, so she gets her right credit. Now, I call Richard the notorious RB because of the things that he got up to. Now, in the introduction to The Rivals, he writes this: any errors that have arisen, he blames on my being by no means conversant with plays in general, either in reading or at the theatre. Well, we'll take the reading bit first, because he was quite a good reader of reading his mother's plays when he was stealing all those lines from Mrs Tryfort and putting them in the mouth of Mrs Malaprop. The whole idea of him being, not being conversant with the theatre is utter nonsense, because both his parents were actors. That's how they made their living. And his father ran Smock Alley Theatre in Dublin. At that time, Dublin was part of Britain. And there were two very famous theatres, the Theatre Royal Drury Lane and the Theatre Royal Smock Alley in Dublin. And his dad was manager of that. Now, if you don't believe me, I'm going to do a bit of screen sharing here, because you'll see a poster of the stratagem. I don't know if you can see that there. Yeah. Let me make it bigger, just to get rid of all that other stuff. There we go. The stratagem, and you can see there the part of Archer played by Mr Sheridan. Now that's Farquhar's the bow stratagem. I've no idea why the bow bit was removed, but you can see that he's performing there in 1753, so 11 years before the Dupe, with the bow stratagem. This is an interesting guy, Mr King, because Mr King played Scrub in that particular production. And there is a Mr King who plays Sharpley in The Dupe. They're quite similar roles, so I'm wondering if it's played by the same actor, his friends. And here we have Mrs Wolfenden, which is Peg Wolfenden, one of the, probably the most famous actor on the stage at that particular time. I'll stop screen sharing. So his mum and dad are literally actors. His mum wrote a play called The Discovery, which they both appeared in. And little Richard, or Dick as I call him, would have been around the theatre all the time. So what he's writing is utter nonsense. But he also writes something else. Let's have a look at this. He talks about plagiarism. which of course he's just committed in the Rivals. And he says, my first wish in attempting a play was to avoid every appearance of plagiarism. Well, what a liar, basically, is what you've got to say. The Rivals was very successful, and it was one of the reasons it was very successful is that it got this fantastic review. And the review was written by Richard Brinsley Sheridan. You couldn't make it up, could you? He wrote a review for his own play and just put a false name on it and published it. So so there we go. And the other interesting thing about Richard is when he became an MP, his first speech to Parliament was having to defend himself against a charge of bribery. So quite some character, Richard. And I think in the play there's a talk about Harry, which is Mrs Friendly's son. And we never hear of again, but he seems to be a bit of a trouble to Mrs Friendly, that Harry, and possibly Richard was too, I suspect. What I would say is, you know, if you don't believe it, most of that is sort of tongue-in-cheek, isn't it, really? But a good exercise, I think, for a group of students would be to put Richard Brinsley Sheridan on trial for a charge of plagiarism. It's a good way of getting people to read, students to read both Frances's plays and Richard's plays, and put him on trial and see if he deserves the credit that he has. He's on all the exam lists, for example, or maybe once we should be looking at his mother. Now, although Mrs Malaprop was stolen, she has a sister called Mrs Friendly, and Mrs Friendly is another giant of a comic creation who does nothing but talk, and you'll find her in the Dupe. She's extremely funny, very funny woman. So let's come on, let's get rid of Richard for a second, and we'll talk about Frances Sheridan. Now, the play, The Dupe, that you'll see, hopefully, wasn't very successful in the theatre. However, as a published piece, it was wildly successful, and her publisher sent her a cheque for £100, which is the equivalent these days of £20,000, which I wouldn't mind getting. I mean, I'm lucky from my book if I get $20, you know, let alone £20,000. But there you go. And of course, one of the reasons for that was gender discrimination. You'll find we have on the channel under extras Susanna Centlever talking about her plays, and when they were published, people found them fantastic. They really enjoyed them, but then they found out, lo and behold, it's written by a woman, and then they said, put it down. No, I don't want that. It's going to be rubbish. And there's also a short sketch from Margaret Cavendish under the extras on the channel, which talks about how women can't write plays. Incidentally, we also put the epilogue to The Dupe, which in itself is a little comic story, under extras, and we've recorded that separately. Now, one of the things that stands out from The Dupe when you read it, or indeed see it on the channel, is just the modernity of the language, because she's writing character language. It's not literary language, she's writing character language to such an extent, you know, when we were rehearsing it, I kept going back to the script saying, are the actors paraphrasing this? Because it sounded like they were, you know, kind of making it up and putting it in their own words, rather than what you'd expect from a play from this particular period, about 260 years old. And I wrote down some of the words that she uses. Yeah, Sharpley, who's a kind of trickster, is asked how he gets away with it, and he says front, and then there's a pause and he repeats it, front, you know, which is a word that we would use today. Somebody, God, they've got a lot of front, you know, and of course it's there in the play. Other words are confab, and stuff. Friendly just says and stuff. What was I saying again? Somebody says, let me tell you, boy, he must be sick of her. Barbara, in the play, Barbara Etherdown, is shortened to Babs, which again is a very modern thing to shorten Barbara to Babs. And there's a section there where rather than saying no, Sharpley says N-O. And that's not something that the actor has invented. That's actually there in the script. Also in the script are stage directions, which there's a kind of business with a handkerchief, which she writes in, and she italicizes certain words. Well, I'll give you an example of that. for example, there is, what is all this, you know? So you could say that, what is all this, you know? But she doesn't. She actually italicizes the is. So the character's then saying, what is all this? There's total confusion all around it as the plots start to collide. She leads sentences, so again, they're not grammatically correct. Rather than saying, I can name the parson and the witness, Sir John says, can name the parson and the witness. And that happens all throughout the play. It's wonderful, comic, witty language. She was an actress, and as an actress, she knew that to get plays on, you had to make some compromises. So most of the scenes are two-handers, and that's very simple. I can tell you as a director, it means that you can just get the two actors together and you're not paying everybody else. You can do these short two-handed scenes in one day, and then the next day you can do them again with other characters and so on. So they don't actually all meet until the last scene. There's 11 props in the play. That's all there is, just the 11 props, and most of them are paper props, letters and so on. I think there's some jewelry and some glasses and wine bottles. All the props can go in a very small bag for touring, and then of course there's only the 3 settings plus a front cloth scene. All those 3 settings again are very easy to transport wherever you go on tour, and I'd imagine that she wanted this play to play on tour. And it's a gender balanced cast. Again, it's a modern thing. We talk about having 50-50 male and female within the play, and she does exactly that. She's got 4 women and 4 men, and all the women have wonderful parts. Right. I mean, we'll talk about the play now, as in Makeshifts, which is on the channel, which is a play from 1908, there's a lot of mention of money all of the time. You know, people's motivation is money, money, money. Sir John, who's the protagonist, the dupe of the title, in today's money, he's worth £42 million, 42 million, which puts into context Mrs Sheridan's spending of his money. Yeah, I mean, the debts, for example, that Mrs Sheridan runs up today, they total £500,000, and the earrings that are presented within the play, the jeweler shows the earrings, they're worth £60,000 in today's money, just for one pair of earrings. In fact, the jeweler gets £150,000. That's what she spent the equivalent of at the jewelers. But there's also, you know, Sharpley wants money up front, which is £21,000 is what he wants. You know, there's the cost of various other things within the play. Cheating tenants is spoken of, and so on. So there's that kind of money situation. There's also some sort of local interest. The Magdalene House had just opened, which was literally, as it says in the play, for fallen women from the gentry class. The Rookery is mentioned in Holborn, which is where Sir John chucks out the tenant who owns a pub there. And there's the war in Germany, which completely coincides with the 18 months that Welford is away. So we know that. So all these local kind of mentions. There is one thing that I need to tell you about, which is going to sound really boring, but nonetheless, it's crucial to the play. Unless you know it, then a lot of the play doesn't make sense. It's the Clandestine Marriage Act from 1753. Now, before this, you'll know from Shakespeare and so on that you could have a hand fasting, that once you held hands in public in front of somebody, you were betrothed, and that was as good as a wedding. It happens in Measure for Measure, it happens in Winter's Tale as well, these hand fastings. The Clandestine Marriage Act outlawed that, and it meant that you had to be married in an Anglican church. Even if you was Catholic, you had to be married in an Anglican church. Now, this is only 11 years before the Dupe was written, and the banns are mentioned in the play in the last act, and that act also brought in the necessity for the banns to be read. I think it's 2 Sundays before the actual wedding. So it did a couple of things, which I'm going to read out because I wanted it's kind of legalese. So you had to be married in a church. The hand fasting wasn't legal. So Rose, even though sharply promises her marriage, it's not valid in law. But it was an offence to run away with an heiress, knowing her to be an heiress. And the punishment for that was hanging, which is what Sharpley talks about. And the priest could be transported. In fact, a priest was transported for doing exactly that at this particular period. And that's mentioned within the play as well. I think Friendly says that. Essentially, it's a law protecting men's property, because the female was the male property, and she didn't have a life of her own. Of course, Frances Sheridan parodies that, because once Mrs Etherdown has married Sir John, she's not liable for his debts, so she's able to spend as freely as she likes, which of course she does. There is a serious side to the Dupe, and it's the seduction of Emily. Sharply sort of runs away with her, elopes with her forcibly. She doesn't consent to it, and takes her to Mrs Private's, which is probably one of those kind of whorehouses, basically, where rooms could be rented for an hour at a time. But it's not that's not a pleasant scene, because it's so realistic, and it's another example of what we find in the unnatural tragedy at the extreme, which is also on the channel. But in this particular play, the scene between them, again, I'll just read you some of the things that are said, because unfortunately they're familiar today. Sharpley says, "I never knew a man hated for an act of violence of this kind in my life." And of course, he's talking about rape there. And then he says to her, "How much prettier you are when you smile." And of course, I'm sure every woman who's watching this will have had a man at one point in their life say to them, "Come on, darling, smile. That's it. You look a lot better," and so on. Yeah. He says that he can spy assent under an angry brow. You know, that kind of no means yes. No is in fact a come on, being a defense in sexual violence cases. He also says that, "Don't worry, I won't tell anyone." Again, unfortunately familiar. And he gaslights her. He says, I wish you knew your own mind, because you were saying one thing one moment and now you're saying this." This whole idea of women not really having sort of stable imaginations, and so therefore a man didn't know if she said yes or no, which means that there's the assent there to commit an act of sexual violence. I mean, it's a great scene, but unfortunately, you know, really near the knuckle. Let's go to something a little bit more pleasant, which is feminism. Now, Mrs Etherdown is called that for a reason. It's a pun on her name, Mrs Everdown, because one of her previous occupations is said to be a washerwoman, and that, of course, was code for prostitute. So that's why she's called Mrs Everdown. Sir John says to her, and again I'm going to read, "What the devil are you, a woman or a fiend?" And she's not his idea of what a woman should be, you know, meek and mild and so on. And she plays on that. And she said, Mrs Sheridan says, "I'm a woman of spirit, a woman of fashion, a woman of pleasure, expense, profusion, luxury. What do you think of me now?" You know, I mean, what a statement, even though she's supposed to be, you know, the kind of baddie within it. It's a fantastic speech. The other thing is the idea of self. Now, there was a famous book in the middle of the 20th century written by Irving Goffman called The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. The idea being that in life, in order to get by, we play a number of roles depending on what the context is. And that happens within the play. Everybody is pretending to be what they're not. You know, often they're in disguise, but often they're just showing a different facet of their character, depending on what the scene is and who else is in the scene. Again, I wrote this down, that there are two Sharpleys, and Sharpley's not even his name. He's called Randall by Welford. Whether that is his real name or not, we don't know. And Mrs Everdown says, "I never knew what his name was." So, you know, there's at least two Sharpleys there. There's two Mrs Everdowns, Mrs. Friendly speaks all the time, but her husband says, no, actually, she's not like that. You don't really know her. She's using it as a kind of mask, a disguise. So John boasts of being a playboy, and he's got his list of 9 women that he's supposed to have sex with. And again, Mr. Friendly says, look, mate, that isn't you. We know that's not you. So again, he's playing a role. And Emily and Welford seem to be playing roles straight out of Jane Austen, with their sort of false elopement and so on, and him being Captain Welford, etc. Jane Austen wasn't even born at this particular time, but it really has got that feeling of Jane Austen about it. So I'm going to finish there, and I'll talk about her, Frances Sheridan's literary legacy, because she did have a legacy, and it wasn't through her rogue of a son, R.B. Dick Sheridan. It was through her daughters, and through her 2 daughters, there were 2 very famous authors, novelists, with the name Le Fanu. There was Alicia Le Fanu, and later Sheridan Le Fanu. And so there we go. There's a direct line from those daughters down to those very famous writers and back to Frances Sheridan. So that's me just sort of rambling on about the play as much as I can. I love the play. It's one of my favourites. It's one of the reasons why we started the channel. It certainly deserves to be on the stage. And if there's any conversations about plays being done, Frances should have her place at the table. We've got many more plays to come, and we're looking forward to sharing them with you. So thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy the plays. And if you can subscribe, it really does help, because it gives these women greater prominence on YouTube and elsewhere. So again, thank you very much.